This is Chapter 2. We're going to outline the production possibilities, frontier, and opportunity costs, comparative advantage and trade, and cover the market system. So just a reminder, scarcity and trade-offs. Households and firms and governments continually face decisions on how to best use their scarce resources. Scarcity is a situation in which unlimited wants exceed the limited amount of resources available to fulfill those wants. Sacrifices are required for trade-offs, and economics teaches us tools to help us make good trade-offs. When deciding how to use your scarce resources, workers, and machinery, if Tesla wants to produce more of the Model X SUV, those resources will not be available to produce the Model S sedans. And this is kind of the basis of all these decision makings that we study in economics. When we're talking about a productions possibility frontier, or a PPF, it is a curve showing the maximum obtainable combination of two goods that can be produced with available resources and technology. Is the PPF a positive or normative tool? The answer is positive. It shows what is, not what should be. So let's talk about this. This is an example of a production possibility frontier. As you can see, this is just a straight line. It's not the curve, but we'll talk about that next. Tesla can produce sedans or SUVs. So on choice A, they're producing all sedans and 0 SUVs. So all sedans is 80 per day and 0 SUVs. If they want to produce more SUVs, they must reduce the if they want to produce more sedans, they must reduce the number of SUVs and vice versa, because they only have so many workers, so much machine, and so much time. So if you go to point B, they're actually producing quantity on the vertical axis is 60 sedans and 20 SUVs per day. And then you go down the line. Now, point G is a combination that is unobtainable given current resources. There's only a few ways that we could hit point G, which is 60 and 50, which is 110. And we're saying that that's really not possible, right? 60 and 50. So basically, every combination on this point adds up to 80, because that's our max production of vehicles. This is an assumption that we produce. The trade-off is 1 for 1, right? We give up one SUV or we give up one sedan to reproduce one or the other. So points outside of the line are unobtainable. Points like F inside the line is technically inefficient. So we're producing 30 and 10. There's multiple reasons we might be inefficient, but we're not reaching our maximum obtainable points. A, B, C, D, and E are our maximum obtainable points given our current resources and technology. So, opportunity cost is the highest value of alternative that must be given up to engage in an activity. So in order to get to point B, we have to give up 20 sedans in order to produce 20 SUVs. So usually usually it's not a 1-for-1 trade-off. So in this situation, we're going to trade tanks for automobiles. On the previous slide, opportunity costs were constant, but opportunity costs often increase. Why? Because some resources are better suited to one task or another. The first resource to switch are the ones best suited for switching. So in this instance, we can produce 0 automobiles and 400 tanks. On the next one, we produce 350 tanks and 200 automobiles. It only reduces tanks by 50 and increases automobiles by 200. Now on point C, we increase automobiles by another 200, but we have to reduce the tanks by 150. So again, they're not an even 1-for-1 swap. The resources already devoted to an activity, the smaller the payoff. So there was a smaller payoff from moving from point B to point C. As more economic resources become available, an economy can move out from A to B. So we could have more economic resources. This could be growth to increase the productions of goods or services. This could be a technology change. This panel shows a technology change. Usually the technology change is technically for one of these items, right? It might be for both, but usually we can just produce more automobiles. We got more efficient with that. So therefore, this shift in the curve, we now have this curve because of a technology change. Suppose you have limited amount of time to study for two exams, economics and accounting. Of course, since you're in my economics class, you'd be studying for economics, but what would your production possibility curve look for the exam grades? A straight line like the PPF and SUV, or a bowed outward curve like the PPF for tanks and automobiles? And one of the reasons is maybe the more you study, you're not really gaining any more knowledge in that specific subject, right? Answer 2. Because the hours spent studying economics is much more valuable and has a lower opportunity curve the first hour than the last hour. You're not going to get the same out of each hour of studying. Now let's talk about comparative advantage and trade. You and your neighbor have a limited time to pick apples or cherries. The table below shows the amount of each fruit you could each pick by devoting all your time to that fruit. If you devote all your time to picking apples, you could pick 20 pounds of apples and 0 cherries. But your neighbor, they could pick 30 pounds of apples and 0 cherries. And if you devote all your time to picking cherries, you could pick 20 pounds, while your neighbor could pick 0 pounds of apples and 60 pounds. So that's your production possibility frontier. It's a one-for-one trade-off. Your neighbor, however, it's not a one-for-one trade-off, right? If you spent all your time picking cherries, you'd pick 20. If you spent all your time picking apples, you'd pick 20. Your neighbor, similarly, can pick 60 pounds of cherries compared to 30 pounds of apples. So what would you do? In this situation, you would specialize. You and your neighbor would trade. So this is the basis of all trade, the act of buying and selling. Could your neighbor benefit from trade? She's better at picking apples and cherries. Both of you can benefit from trade by specializing what you are relatively good at. Let's see how. So, your consumption without trade. Without trade, you could get 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries. Point A. Your neighbor, without trade, could get 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. Point C. Now, if you specialize, you could get 20 pounds of apples and your neighbor could pick 60 pounds of cherries. Then if you trade, you can obtain point B. You actually obtain a point outside of your PPF. If you trade 10 pounds of your apples for 15 pounds of your neighbor's cherries, you will consume 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of cherries, a point outside your curve. Your neighbor will also consume outside their PPF, and they will get 10 pounds of apples and 45 pounds of cherries. You and your neighbor are both better off as a result of trade. Note, your neighbor benefits from trade even though she could produce more of either fruit than you could. And this is it in a table format. So we got the production without trade of you and your neighbor, production with trade, and then consumption. And so, technically, the gains from trade is you increased your pounds in apples by 2 and your pounds in cherries by 3, and your neighbor increased their pounds in apples by 1 and their pounds in cherries by 3. So gains from specialization in trade. How could you both benefit from trade when your neighbor is much better than you are? Economists say your neighbor had an absolute advantage in both. So absolute advantage, you're better at, oops, let me go back here. Absolute advantage. You're better, or your ability of an individual or firm or a country to produce more of a good or service than competitors using the same amount of resources. Your neighbor and I had the same amount of hours, but my neighbor was better at picking cherries, right? So a comparative advantage is your ability of an individual, a firm, or a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost. They had a lower opportunity cost, so it was better for them to specialize in cherries and trade with me since I could specialize in apples or cherries even though I didn't have absolute advantage. Comparative advantage is the basis of trade. So the opportunity cost of picking the apples. For you, the opportunity of cost of picking at 1 pound of apples was 1 pound of cherries. But to the neighbor, for every 1 pound of apples they picked, they lost 2 pounds of cherries. So the opportunity cost of picking 1 pound of cherries for me was 1 pound of apples. It's 1 for 1. Theirs was half a pound of apples. This is the basis of comparative advantage. It's the basis of trade, not absolute advantage. Just because I'm better at something with the same amount of resources, I can produce more, doesn't mean that that's the best option for me. Individuals, firms, and countries are better off if they specialize in producing goods and services for which they have a comparative advantage and obtain the other goods by trading. People living together have to divide up household chores. Basic economic concepts like comparative advantage can provide useful insight of division of labor. Suppose Jack is faster than Jill at both cooking and laundry. Jack is much faster at preparing tasty meals, while only a little faster at doing laundry. Jack's comparative advantage is in cooking a tasty meal, because he gives up the opportunity to perform less laundry than Jill. So he should specialize in this, while Jill specializes in laundry. Now let's move on to the market system. There are two key groups that participate in modern economy. Households consist of individuals who provide the factors of production. They provide labor, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurial ability. Households receive payments for these factors. So they either start a business, they provide labor, they provide resources, capital, or they have access to natural resources by selling these to the firms in the factor market. This is where we sell our labor or resources. Firms supply goods and services to product markets. Households buy these products from the firms. This is a circular flow diagram. So it's going to illustrate how markets and participants are linked. So our participants are the households and firms. The households provide labor, capital, and natural resources and entrepreneurial ability to the firms, which then produce goods and services in the product markets and sell them to households. Firms pay money, wages, and other payments, interest, to households. The households use that money to pay for the goods and services, and that money goes to the firms. Like all economic models, the circular flow diagram is a simplified version of reality. In this version of reality, there is no financial system, there is no government, there are no foreign buyers and sellers of goods and services. As we know, that's not true. But that's the circular flow diagram. Let's talk about a free market. A free market is a market in which one with few government restrictions on how a good or service can be produced or sold, or how factors of production can be employed. Countries that come closest to the free market bench have been more successful than those with centrally planned economies in providing their people with rising living standards. This concept is not new. Adam Smith argued for free markets in 1776 treatise, an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth of the nations, of nations. So let's talk about free market. We don't actually have a completely free market in the United States, but we don't have a centrally planned economy, and hopefully we're not moving there, right? The beauty of the market mechanism is it is not immediately obvious that markets will do better than centrally planned economy systems for satisfying human desires. After all, individuals are acting in their own rational self-interest. But markets with flexible prices allow collective actions of households and firms to signal the relative worth of goods or services. In this way, it is the invisible hand that allows individuals' responses to collectively end up satisfying the wants of the consumers. I'll post a video on Moodle that discusses the invisible hand. It's a quick video, but it helps make sense of the invisible hand. How do you make an iPad? Although Apple engineers design the iPad, Apple does not manufacture iPad components, nor does it assemble the final product. Hundreds of firms are involved. Many probably don't even know their product is being used in an iPad. But guided by their own self-interest, they all contribute to the final product, without any desire to enrich Apple or provide enjoyment for iPad users. The role of entrepreneur is important. An entrepreneur is someone who operates a business, bringing together the factors of production, labor, capital, and natural resources to produce goods and services. The best entrepreneurs create products that consumers never know they even wanted. An example of this is Henry Ford's statement, "If I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." And then he invented a car. Entrepreneurs make vital contributions to economic growth, often with considerable personal risk and sacrifice. Here's an example of products introduced by entrepreneurs at small firms: air conditioning, airplane, the automobile mass production, automobile windshield wiper, biomagnetic imaging, biosynthetic insulin, vacuum tube or a television, a zipper. They were responding to customer demands and introducing new products. Government policies encouraging entrepreneurship are likely to increase economic growth and raise the standard of living. In free market, government does not restrict how firms produce and sell the goods, or how they employ factors of production. Now, we do actually restrict. We have a minimum wage, which is a restriction, which sometimes skews the marketplace. However, governments must provide a sound legal environment that will allow the market system to succeed. One of these important things is protection of private property. When criminals can take wages or profits, households and firms have little incentive to work hard. Property rights of individuals or firms have to be exclusive have to the exclusive use of their property, including the right to buy or sell. So if you don't have that, Cuba does not have that, and I will post a video that's pretty intriguing about how many people and generations are living in houses, because although they have the right to it, they don't have the right to sell their house in Cuba. Enforcements of contracts and property rights. It is important for transactions across time to occur. An independent court system is critical for this. So in economies, you'll hear that have a big underground economy or illegal economy. That's because they can't protect their property rights and they don't have a system, and potentially bribes are working and there's corruption, and this doesn't protect entrepreneurs. Copyrights and patents protect intellectual property for creators and inventors in order to encourage innovation. In 2011, a publisher sued the estate of Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle for free access to his characters for new stories. Federal appeals judge and economist Richard Posner granted access without payment to the characters. What are the consequences of this? So that ends the overview of chapter 2.